Thanks for listening to the Pastor with No Answers. Join us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, contribute to this podcast, all by going to pastorwithnoanswers.com. And now for another episode of Pastor with No Answers. There's no time to change your mind. How could you have been so blind? You've been left behind.
Hey, I'm that old... Wait. Hey, I'm that dude on those old You've Been Left Behind movies with the big old mustache.
And I don't know what to do because I'm that dude's pastor. And this is the Pastor with No Answers. Do you think those movies... So I guess some of our listeners, a lot of them are probably in the dark. So in youth group, we used to watch these scary 1970s movies that depicted the Rapture and all that sort of thing.
But we weren't in youth group in 1970.
Yeah. Right. So we're in the late 80s, early 90s, but we're watching these old-ass 1970s movies. Do you think, and so basically it just depicts people being raptured and someone being left behind and someone who had recently given their heart to Christ and all that stuff. Do you think that they were for like 100% scare tactic?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think they would say it's a way to wake people up to the realities of what could be happening very soon. But yeah, it's to scare you.
I mean, good intentions for sure.
Yeah,
but that
for sure.
razor, man. Do you remember that razor in the sink? Like I think the girl ran. Yeah, his wife is the one that did not give her heart to Christ, and so she runs in the house. She's looking for her husband, and there's an electric razor in the sink, and it's on. And she knows what happened once she saw that razor.
Yeah, the one thing I remember too is how they right when the rapture happened, they kept showing shots of the sky with clouds. Yeah. Remember that? Like a blue sky and a bunch of clouds. That was like their rapture special effects.
Totally.
I guess.
Yeah, it kind of scared me, man. Well, hey, I want to publicly congratulate Dr. Jared Svensson. Jared, why don't you tell everybody what you studied and what you're a doctor in?
Yeah, so I recently defended my dissertation, meaning I now have a PhD in the department's curriculum and instruction, and I basically researched teacher education. I created 2 analytic models, and then I did some empirical analysis using those models, and my committee liked it, and they said, congratulations, you're done. So I'm happy to be done because it took me about 6.5 years. It took me about 2 years to write, but I'm all finished. So
do you want to call this podcast The Pastor and the Doctor with No Answers now?
That's all right.
Hey, would you be, seriously, I want you to hear a Joey question coming at you. Would you be pissed in heaven if like tomorrow on the way to school you get killed in a car wreck, and so like all that work is kind of for nothing? Like, would you,
I wouldn't.
Would you look at Jesus and be like, hey, man, seriously, could you have not, like, told me not to get my doctorates? Like, do you know how much work I put forth? Like, would you have a conversation with Jesus, or would you just think it's funny?
Well, first off, it'd be hilarious. Yeah. Like, the irony is so great. So I would love that part of it. But secondly, though, it wasn't about getting the degree. I actually enjoyed the process, with the exception of, like, the last 2 months.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed the process. So this is what I wanted to do. It wasn't like I was forced into it. So there's no regrets if I died tomorrow. You know, but it would be very funny though. The irony would be awesome.
Yeah, just imagine, like, I would make sure in the newspaper it says Jared Svensson is survived by so and so, and then Jared Svensson received his doctorate's degree 3 days before his death. And people would read that and be like, damn, that kind of sucks, man.
Right. Yeah. But as long as that doctor's in the obituary, I'm good to go.
All right. Well, that's the question that all of us are asking. Will we die or will we be raptured? Or I think our 2 guests may have a whole different perspective on this. So I'm looking forward to having this conversation, welcoming our 2 guests right now. Okay, so we are here with our guest. It's Bob Harper, right?
That's right.
Bob Harper, pastor, and we have Jason Wisdom. And Jason, I know you're like a rocker, like you were in Becoming the Archetype. Is that still a band?
Yeah, they're still a band. I'm not still in that band. But
That's
they
right.
Are
Screw
still
those
a band.
guys.
Yeah.
You don't need them.
No. I'm their biggest fan.
Yeah, so it's funny because both of y'all were referred by friends of mine. Well, so Mikey Bridges was on the Bad Christian podcast, and I actually hit him up and said, hey, would you want to talk about end times? And he was just like, dude, I do not want to talk about that. He's just like, wouldn't be able to give you what you want, but my pastor, on the other hand, would. And then Taylor Atkins had been talking you up for a long time, Jason, saying you got to get them on. So the premise of this podcast is not necessarily always to get opposing viewpoints. Like me and my brother's mission is just to get some people on and talk, and I don't want to always be strategic about the guests. So it very well turn out that you guys both have very similar points of view, and that'll just be a great discussion because we won't be having to, pick apart each other's arguments. So, but tell us a little bit about where you're from, Bob, and am I correct that you're a pastor?
Yes, you are correct. And I am from Ventura, California, which is a seaside town a little bit north of Los Angeles, a little bit south of Santa Barbara.
Yeah.
And one of the most pleasant places on the earth.
Yeah. Awesome. And how long have you been pastoring? What kind of church is it?
I've been pastoring this church for 16 years, and I have been a pastor for, 25 years.
Gotcha. Awesome. And what about you, Jason? What's your story? What's your deal?
I live northeast of Atlanta, Georgia. So I just tell people I'm from Atlanta because nobody knows where Auburn, Georgia is.
Right.
Anyway, I played in Becoming the Archetype for a long time. I play in a band called Death Therapy now. It's like a techno heavy metal band kind of thing. We're going to be at Audio Feed Festival with you guys.
Oh, nice.
The Bad Christian dudes. So we'll see you there.
Awesome.
I taught for a long time.
Yeah.
Like taught the Bible and stuff. So I'm not a pastor. I'm not an expert. I'm not a theologian, but I really love talking about this kind of stuff. So,
Jason, what do you make a living off of your music?
Yeah, I wish I made a living just off of music, but my full-time job is a substitute teacher.
Awesome. Me and Jared did that for years.
I did that for about probably 8 or 9 months after college.
Yeah. It's actually it's an art to walk into a classroom and as a substitute teacher and have control over the classroom. Are you able to do that?
Well, my trick is that I try to substitute mainly for like orchestra and band classes.
Nice.
And I'll show up with my bass guitar and my rig.
Yeah.
And like I can immediately like get their attention by like just sitting on a stool with like my guitar and starting to play or something.
Yeah.
So I'll play songs for them and they'll play songs for me, and it's like a School of Rock in real life kind of thing.
Awesome.
That's pretty cool, yeah.
All right, well, let me jump right in by giving a depiction of how I was always brought up to believe that the end times was going to unfold. And then what I want to do is give Jason and Bob a chance to pick two things that they want to begin on by saying, yeah, here's the two things that are just majorly flawed with that, or maybe one of them you agree. But I was brought up in Pentecostal churches where we were scared to death of the rapture. I'm writing a book on just how my mind was pretty messed up and just always being scared that I would cuss or lust and then die with sin on my heart, or the rapture would come and I'd be left behind and that sort of thing. So basically what I was always taught, and Jared may be a little bit different but relatively the same, is that things would begin with the church being raptured. So all of a sudden, 1 billion or less people would be gone from the face of the earth, And then almost immediately, everybody would be like, oh, so the Bible was right. But then you'd have a lot of people that just like, no, whatever, Mother Nature is just cleansing herself and that sort of thing. And so people would kind of go about their business. The world would flourish. The Antichrist would surface. And then you'd basically have a lot of peace and people would come together. Everybody's like super friendly and all that sort of thing. And so then you would have some people that had been witnessed to, and they're like, no, I know better. This is not good. And so when everybody's taking the mark of the beast to, be able to purchase their goods and all that stuff, they're just like, no, I'm not touching that. I got to survive these 7 years so I can go to heaven. And so maybe some of those people would escape to the mountains and get away with their canned goods and all that sort of thing. So then 3.5 years or so, somewhere in the middle, the shit hits the fan. The Antichrist starts revealing his true colors, and God starts pouring his wrath out. And then instead of the 7 years of tribulation, it's really the 3.5 years of tribulation where people are tortured by big bugs and just all kinds of crazy stuff. And then Jesus would come back with all of the raptured folks and kind of destroy everything, and he'd be around for 1,000 years ruling everything. Jared, do you want to add or take away to any of that?
No, that's pretty much how we were raised. You're absolutely right. That's a pretty accurate reflection of that. So.
Yeah, in fact, there's one bug that like stings you, and you're tortured for 6 months, I think. Like just you're wallowing on the ground for like 6 months in complete agony. But I think I was brought up to believe that if I didn't have the mark of the beast, I would at least be spared from that bug. So the 6-month sting bug, yep, not going to be messed with that one because I don't have the mark of the beast. So, Bob, why don't you dive in? Take as much time as you want.
Okay, well, for starters, it's hard to pick like two things that are flawed because the whole thing is like crazy wrong. I wasn't raised in the church, and I came under the influence of some, really gracious people when I was a very young man, and they would share with me and tried to help me, and they would point out these things in the Bible. And so, one October night, I went to church with them and had this profound conversion. It was kind of the tail end of the Jesus People movement, and those days it was really common to have these real significant, life-transforming moments. And so I had one of those. The next day, Sunday, I go to church the next day, and at this point, I'm a single guy. This is in the days before internet, cell phones, all that stuff. I have no telephone, I have no clock, I have no newspaper, anything like that.
Yeah.
I show up at church, and it's a Sunday morning in October, and there is not a soul there.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, damn, I didn't say the prayer right.
Yeah.
And they got raptured, and I've been left behind. And I thought I would be one of those guys you mentioned who would tell everybody, hey, here's what you need to know. Don't take the mark,
right?
And so on. So there's so many things wrong with that perspective. I mean, it's hard to say where to begin exactly. The whole concept that God is like up there in the heavens, spoiling with this serious anger that he needs to pour out on one particular generation of people.
Yeah.
And so he's waiting. It's like all these things happen. The Holocaust, the communist slaughter of millions in the 20th century, child abuse, all these horrible things happen, but somehow there's going to be that one thing that will happen that will finally trigger that. The last of the Gentiles will come in, the rapture will happen, and then God will, all that pissed off anger from thousands a year will get poured out onto
It was building
everybody.
up, man. He's got to release it at some point. It's almost like a male's sex drive, If you got to release it at some point.
Exactly. I mean, that's one thing, and then a second thing, I guess, is the idea that everything.
Well, let me stop you right there.
Okay.
A devil's advocate would say, well, yeah, he did that with the flood. Isn't that the same? That's what he did in Noah's days.
Right, that he destroyed all of humanity. Well, here's where, there are so many areas so many things that begin to run off of this. But, really, I know you had Peter Enns, who's a great human being, by the way.
Yeah.
You had him on your show recently. And in Pete's one of his early books, Inspiration and Incarnation, the one that got him fired from Westminster.
Yeah.
In that book, he points out that the first 11 chapters of Genesis, those are common stories that some later Hebrew grabbed and took, and then put Hebrew theology into them.
Yeah.
And so the corollary between Noah and this view of the end times, I don't think it really necessarily flies.
Gotcha. Cool.
Go ahead.
No, that's cool. Real quick, Jared, is there any static or anything like that?
No, so far so good.
All right, cool. All right, go ahead, sir.
So the second thing I was going to say is that about that particular viewpoint is the idea that everything in the book of Revelation has some kind of a corollary. It's some kind of a graphic, cryptic image of something that will happen. Like, you talked about the mosquitoes that would sing, and the scorpions with the fire coming out of their mouth. I remember being told those were tanks.
Yeah.
And or helicopter gunships and all that. And even now, when I teach the book of Revelation, there's so much that people have to unlearn to be able to learn the actual message of the book.
Right.
And one thing I find myself having to say to people again and again and again is, stop thinking that this is like some kind of series of cryptic images of things you would recognize.
Right.
That's not what's going on with these images.
That's interesting.
So what would you do with so let's just go ahead and discount Revelation now. What would you do with Matthew 24, 25 to 34, where Christ prophesies his coming again, the sun turning black, stars falling from the sky, and those kinds of things?
Right. So you're talking about the Olivet Discourse there.
Yes.
And so now that's an interesting piece of literature there. And again, there's so many issues that run out of this. Like, if we're going to talk about the Olivet Discourse, Mark 13 is almost certainly the beginning, because it's kind of the standard view in New Testament scholarship today that the synoptics begin with Mark. Okay, so you're talking about what's called the Olivet Discourse, and from Matthew, which of course is one of the three synoptic gospels. And if we're going to do that, we really need to go to Mark 13 to begin, because Matthew and Luke both take Mark and they build Mark out and add other material to that. So when you read in Mark 13, the whole narrative is a little bit more straightforward than it is in Matthew. But what's happening there is when Jesus talks about the moon turning to blood and this kind of stuff, he's using common apocalyptic language of the time. The real issue of the Olivet Discourse is, when will Jesus' reign begin? He comes out of the temple with the disciples. They say, "In this temple, like the most bitchin' thing you've ever seen." And he goes, "You think this is so great? Not one stone will be left upon another." They go sit on the Mount of Olives. They look back at the temple, and they say to him, "So what will be the sign of these things and of your coming, or your coming into your kingdom?" And then Jesus gives this list of things, and these are events that really happened in the first century, with the destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple. And Jesus is saying to them, letting them know that his age begins when the age of the temple ends. And so when he gets to the coming in the clouds and that kind of stuff, I mean, do we really think Jesus was like going to ride a cloud like the sun would turn, or the moon would turn blood red? Jesus will come like scooting on a cloud like a magic carpet. It's apocalyptic language, and would have been understood at the time as being highly symbolic.
Gotcha.
So I take it you're probably a post-millennialist or amillennialist?
Am I a post or amillennialist?
Yes.
Great question. Okay, so...
Well, let's hold that thought. Hold that thought.
Okay.
Why don't you dive in here, Jason? Couple low-hanging fruit that you want to snag here.
Yeah. Just the most immediate thing that jumps out to me is my experience growing up was probably similar to yours. I grew up in the South.
Yeah.
And so I heard a lot of the same stuff. And then, like any, 17-year-old kid, 18-year-old kid who was going to church, like, I was like, man, the coolest book in the Bible seems like it's Revelation. I should read that.
Yeah.
It's exciting. It's got people dying. So I can remember being in the end of my high school years and sitting down to read the book of Revelation. Just for the fun of it. I didn't have any agenda at all at that point in my life, and I can remember.
Whoa, you read Revelation for fun?
It's pretty metal, though. It's pretty hardcore.
I could just, Anyway, Anyway, my point is I didn't read it with any theological agenda in mind, and I can remember coming away with it being like surprised that I was like, well, when did the rapture happen?
Right.
In there? Like I can remember that vividly from after I read it. And so more or less my take, like just in a broad way on all of this would be to say, the question that I always ask is, how many times is Jesus coming back?
Right.
You know what I mean? If he's coming back one time, then there's really no rapture sort of like thing. But if there is a rapture, then he kind of at least comes back maybe 1.5 times. You know, like he sort of comes and gets people and then goes back, and then he comes later with those same people.
Well, does he have to come for the rapture to happen? Don't some people just think that all the Christians disappear and Jesus didn't really come back? He just disappeared everybody?
I think it's possible that people think that.
Right.
But I think if you were to press those same people to go to the scripture passages that they're going to use to support that, you'll find in those that it's all talking about his coming.
Yeah.
So you can't really separate the idea that he's coming from the idea of the rapture.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's just where I come from. Is like, I kind of grew up being taught the same thing. Kind of got skeptical of it, and my main beef with it is I think we got to work with what Scripture teaches us and not try to add in a bunch of other stuff. So I think any view of like, hey, Jesus is going to come back sometime invisibly before he comes back visibly, and he's going to take the church because of all of this other stuff you were describing, like, different people's interpretations. I think that's just getting wacky.
Yeah.
When we should just really be looking at the fact that, hey, all of Christendom has agreed for like 2,000 years Jesus is coming back at the end, at the resurrection. Let's, you know what I mean? Let's focus on that.
Yeah.
If I get raptured at some point, I'm not going to complain.
Right.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's what's going to happen.
Yeah. All right. So let me ask you this first, Jason, and then let's hear what Bob thinks. But so what very practically, what exactly is going to happen next? Like, what's the beginning of the end? I mean, what do you think the Bible teaches is the next step for us Christians that don't die?
That don't die?
The last generation.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a loaded question because given what my point of view on it is, I would say I really don't have any idea what's going to happen, and I don't think I'm supposed to. Other than that, I think we all as believers have a responsibility to be prepared for whatever tribulation we might face, and I think it's actually really offensive. That's a terrible word. I'm sorry I used it.
That's okay.
It's
sorry for offending you.
Oh, I'm offended. Anyway, it's really offensive to people in the world now and in the past who are having their heads cut off and their tongues cut out. And
that's true. I did not think of that.
For the Christian faith to say, man, I'm just so glad that before it gets bad, I'll be out of here. The reality is it's bad, and it's been bad for a lot of people. And I think we as Christians, that's our responsibility. I don't really know what happens next. I don't know.
Hey, well, it's bad in America too, man. They're saying shit about us on Facebook. Okay?
I know we can't use the bathrooms in Target. But yeah, that's not a really deep theological answer. But honestly, I think I think the deal is with all of people probing into different interpretations of Scripture. I actually think it all comes back to a flaw, which is that they want to find a key that somehow they think will unlock this mysterious box, and all of a sudden they'll understand it all.
Yeah.
And by understanding it all, it'll alleviate their fears. And I think the whole concept of like no one knows when it's going to happen, which is over and over again in what Jesus is saying, I kind of think that's bigger than just no one knows the time. I think there's a lot of it we just don't know. And I think the whole enterprise of being like, well, let's figure out what this means, and let's figure out what this beast putting his foot here means, and let's figure out what, you know what I mean? I think that whole enterprise is guided. That
All right, so before we move on to Bob, what do you think it means, the passage that says in a twinkling of an eye will be gone and all that sort of thing? You just think it's mystery, like we're not supposed to really know?
Oh, no, I would just say, like I was saying earlier, I think Jesus comes once, and so I would say there's no reason to think that the passages in like First Thessalonians and First Corinthians, there's no reason to think those are separate events from the final coming of Christ, when we will go out to meet him, which is the Greek concept. Not that like Jesus will come and we'll poof and disappear, but that like the book of Revelation style, like he'll come, we'll go out to greet him, to meet him, to bring him back into the new heavens and new earth, and all be here. So I think all of that, all those passages people pull out and say, oh, look, here it is. It's clear. It says in the twinkling of an eye. Yeah. I would say, yeah, but it's not clear to me that's a separate event from.
So do you buy into the literal notion of a literal millennial reign here on earth?
No, I'm not. I would be an amillennialist in that regard, me personally. I guess that's the most direct answer I can give you to that. I would just say that I think, I think the book of Revelation is one of those things, like Bob was saying earlier, there's corollaries all throughout Scripture, and if you look at it, something like, I can't remember what the number is, but Bob maybe knows, something like 300 of the images or something used in the book of Revelation are directly taken from Old Testament passages and stuff. And I would just say, one of the cool things and weird things and confusing things about Hebrew prophecy in general is that it usually has a literal interpretation for that generation, and it usually has some future interpretation that is kind of harder to understand. So the book of Revelation is clearly written to a group of people at a particular time. It's not like John sat down to write the book of Revelation for people 2,000 years later,
Wow.
Like he was writing it for people. The first part of it actually says this is being written to describe things that are soon going to happen. And then he goes and addresses 7 churches. It's like, is he mocking those churches by writing a letter to them that has nothing to do with them?
Wait, so those people have already been stoned and they got pain for?
Well, I guess what I'm saying is, if I were to take that, the way I would take that is to say I do think a lot of the book of Revelation and a lot of what Jesus is talking about in the Olivet Discourse, and this is where Bob and I would agree, but maybe not entirely, that I think a lot of that describes in apocalyptic language the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. And so, it's really scary sounding, but you find that same scary language when the temple was destroyed by Babylon and other stuff in the Old Testament. So
that kind of begs the question: why would Revelation be included in our canon if that time is gone and past? Like, what good does it serve us today as Christians?
Well, I just said, I wouldn't say. Now, this is where I would like Bob to kind of clarify for me. I don't know if he's a full preterist, a partial preterist, or those are big terms, but I'm more sort of, if you can't tell, I'm like trying to do my best Rob Bell impression here. So I can't. I don't want to be I don't want to fall too heavily on one side or the other, but I basically would take it as like, I think there are things in the book of Revelation that do tell us about stuff that happened, that were for that generation, but I think they also tell us about things that are going to happen, broadly speaking, like the return of Christ, the new heavens and the new earth. And they also give us wisdom for persevering through persecution. Just like when we read the Old Testament, it's not worthless to us, even if those things were written to the nation of Israel.
You're not feeling it, Jared?
Not really. No, I'm enjoying the conversation, though.
All right, so Bob, feel free to go anywhere you want, but I want to hear what you think about what Jason said, but also same question to you. What's next? Like, what are we waiting for?
Okay. I don't think the Bible promises us what's coming next. I think that the people of God are called to persevere. I think this is like the great neglected Christian virtue. You look at how God acts in the Bible, and he will make these big promises to people, and then he partially fulfills them, and then they wait. They wait sometimes for generations before he comes and does it. And they never have a clue, like, here are the 10 things to happen. So when 9 happens, make sure your kids are tucked in at night because it's going to come. It doesn't happen like that.
Yeah.
And so I think we're supposed to persevere. We don't know.
Yeah.
We're just supposed to be faithful and advance the kingdom.
Yeah. So do you believe that? I mean, obviously the world's going to come to an end, right?
Sure. And as far as the book of Revelation, for starters, why is the book of Revelation in the canon? The book of Revelation has multiple messages in it, certainly, but one of the key messages in it is perseverance, is persevere, and endure. endure in the face of difficulty, endure in the face of superpower malfeasance and so on. And so I think one of the reasons why the Book of Revelation was kept in the canon was that reason, was like this is a message to us to persevere.
Yeah.
Anyway, were you going to ask me something there?
No.
Okay. So as far as, like Jason mentioned, the Old Testament images in the Book of Revelation, and I think he and I would probably agree on almost everything. The thing with the Book of Revelation, virtually everything.
All right, see you guys later then.
Yeah. Virtually everything in the Book of Revelation is drawing on something from the Old Testament, except for the millennium. That is the one image in it that doesn't have some kind of correlation in the Old Testament. So it stands apart, and that may be part of the reason why it has been such an interpretive, kind of thing. You guys asked me a minute ago if I was like post-millennial, amillennial, and then Jason was kind of musing if I'm like preterist or half preterist or part preterist or so on. I see the Book of Revelation like this. The Book of Revelation is actually three things. It is an epistle. It's an epistle to 7 churches and the churches of that time. And so it has very much a message to them. It is a prophecy also, and it claims to be a prophecy. And it's a prophecy in the sense of Hebrew prophecy, just like Jason mentioned. A Hebrew prophecy, it had a meaning for now. It could have a meaning for later on, not necessarily so. But usually the people of the time didn't understand that meaning. And many of the prophecies we love so much from the Old Testament, nobody knew that's what they meant until after it happened. And we look back and said, oh, yeah, that's the suffering servant, and so on. And then the third thing the Book of Revelation is it's an apocalypsis. And so it's written with apocalyptic conventions. And in an apocalypse, one of the key things is the person who would write an apocalypse would write it with a pseudonym, usually some famous person from the past, and they would speak about events that everybody knew had already happened, and they would speak about them as if they were prophecy. And then they would get to a certain point where perhaps the tone would change, and they would then begin to talk far into the future. And so when scholars look back at apocalyptic writings that they find, they date them like that. They say, okay, so we know certain events happened, we can see that in this apocalypse, but we can see from that point forward in this apocalypse, it goes crazy and doesn't happen. So therefore, the person wrote it at the end of known events. So like to create an example, if I were going to write an apocalypse about the current political situation, I might start out, Franklin Roosevelt was in my wheelchair one day, and an angel appeared to me and took me up into heaven away from my wheelchair, and he showed me the future. And I might talk about, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and I'd use like this heavily symbolic language about those events. And then I would say, and so then I saw Donald Trump was elected and the United States was destroyed. Yeah. And so then later on somebody would look back and go, okay, well that's the point where he wrote it. So when we look at the Book of Revelation with that lens on it, then chapter 10 becomes that part where John begins to look into the future. Up to chapter 10 there, he's talking using apocalyptic language, and there are some caveats to this, but he's using apocalyptic language to speak about things that have happened or are happening at that time. Chapter 10 then, that's where the angel comes and stands on the sea and the mountain that splits apart. He gives him the scroll, like in Ezekiel, says, eat this, and then you must prophesy again. And then he begins to prophesy. And from that point forward, 11, 12, 13, and on from there, John is talking, first of all, about different images of the church. And then he begins to talk about the end itself. The challenging thing for the end itself in the Book of Revelation is John seems to be talking about the destruction of Rome. Yeah. And Rome is not destroyed that way. Rome died with a whimper. It didn't die with a bang, like it would seem to be in the book. And so, for me personally, I think that John was looking into the future, and I think that, the book promises that Jesus will come back, that there will be, some kind of a world empire happening at that point, and it's hard to draw any more conclusions from it than that.
So
go ahead.
Well, so what about Earth burning up and heaven comes down to Earth, and there'll be a new heavens and new Earth? Is all that stuff just pretty much plain language that means what it says?
Well, I think what the Bible is teaching us is that the heavens and earth will be transformed. I think
Right.
I think about it more in terms of a resurrection. Like Jesus goes into the grave and he looks like himself, comes out 3 days later, looks like himself, but doesn't look like himself. People don't seem to recognize him, and he has certain abilities and so on. He's transformed. I think that we will be resurrected. I think that the creation will be remade or transformed at that point.
Yeah.
So based on what you were saying, Bob, it seems like you're probably a partial preterist then? Is that correct or not?
I suppose. I to be honest, I kind of resist the labels, but
Okay.
But only not because I'm ashamed of them or afraid of them. I just don't really know for sure what people always mean by that.
Sure, I understand that.
So
Can I just say
yeah.
that Bob has like this? I can't see him because the video is not on, but he has this like perfect like voice for like reading the Bible on like a Bible app.
Oh, totally.
Audiobooks, yeah.
Yeah. I have
Him
a
reading the
voice
Bible.
for radio and a face to match. That's why the video's not on.
Awesome.
Hey, can I say something about the millennium?
Yeah, hey, real quick, I agree. Bob could read the worst parts of the Bible, all the bad things, and we would be like, "Oh, that sounds so soothing."
So inspirational.
All right, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Okay, about the millennium. Okay, like I said, that's the one image that we can't find any correlation to that in the Old Testament. It kind of stands alone. And it's been, throughout the history of Christian theology, it's been such a major piece for interpreting not just the book of Revelation, but kind of Christianity. Are you post-millennial, amillennial, premillennial, and so on? There's a little book by Richard Bauckham called A Theology of the Book of Revelation. It's like 130, 140 pages. As far as a scholarly book, it's remarkably accessible.
Yeah.
But one of the things he says in that book is that what I just said about the dating of the book of Revelation, about Revelation 10 being a key chapter, I got that from him. But what he says about the millennium is also like in chapter 11, we have the two witnesses in the temple. Chapter 12, we have the woman who's about to give birth. These are images of the church, of the faithful people of God. And he says the millennium is the same thing. It's not something that's going to happen in the end. It's not the one thing in the book of Revelation that has some kind of corollary in historical life. It's actually an absolute picture of the church.
Yeah, it would be kind of odd if you think about it to take the temple and all of that super literally in a millennium, considering the traditional Christian view that Christ fulfills the temple in all of its, in all of the things that it stands for. The temple's not really just a temple. It points forward to the Messiah. It points forward to Christ, and for Christ himself to then come back into a new temple and a rebuilt temple. And the temple wasn't supposed to be just there. I mean, there were other things that went along with the temple, like sacrifices and the way the temple had to be built according to the old law, et cetera, et cetera. I guess what I'm getting at is one of the beefs I've had with the super, super literal interpretation of the millennium is it seems to almost like trample on what Jesus has done and what he means to Christianity. You know what I mean? It almost is like, well, hey, let's just bring the temple back, because that'd be a pretty sweet looking image to have this giant gold building,
Yeah, absolutely.
So what, with y'all's approach and what y'all have articulated and pretty much find common ground, the depiction that I gave at the beginning, which a lot of, I guess, evangelicals see through those lenses.
It's still the most It's the most popular view currently.
Yeah. So what would you guys say gives you heartburn about that viewpoint from a standpoint of how it affects people negatively? Like, obviously, you guys both are just like, yeah, that's not right. That stinks that so many people believe incorrectly, but how do you think it affects people negatively?
Well, I said this a minute ago, but to be more specific, when I used to teach like middle school kids, for instance, I mean, they have lots of questions about the book of Revelation and stuff because I was teaching Bible at a private school. And I would say that one of the things that drives me the most crazy was that whole sort of like escapism mentality, sort of like, well, at least before it gets bad,
right,
I'll be out of here. Or the kid who'll come up and be like, oh, somebody told me that we're going to actually have to be here through the tribulation. I don't want to have to go through that. That would be awful, And and I'm thinking, man, what a weird mentality that says, I couldn't persevere, like Bob was saying. I don't want to get stung by crazy scorpions that look like tanks either. But you know what I mean? I guess what I'm saying is I think it builds this sort of escapism mentality, which builds on top of another faulty, dualistic sort of escapism mentality in Christianity already. Like, well, yeah, I got saved, now I get to go to heaven, and that's kind of, what I'm saying? It's like it just furthers this notion that all we're here for is to like get our pass to heaven, and then now we just kind of like stick our head in the ground until Jesus poofs us away.
Right.
And holy crap, am I gonna am I gonna get to go in the rapture? Am I gonna have to die when I'm old? I don't want that. So I think that really messes, especially with young people.
Yeah.
So that bugs me.
The thing that this fingers on the chalkboard for me is the entitlement that comes with it.
Yeah.
I'm a faithful American Christian. I'm living in this incredibly prosperous time. I don't really do a lot. This message of incredible suffering and God's escape was given to people who were small in number and trying hard to persevere. But me and my kind of fit lifestyle, I'm going to get to escape everything. Yeah. I remember in the early days of my faith, when I was really like buying into this and trying to memorize it and learn all the images, a guy I knew actually bought a brand new car he couldn't afford. His dad told him, you can't afford that car. And he goes, hey, Dad, I don't have to worry. The rapture's going to come, and I won't have to pay for it.
That's awesome.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a lot of people.
Actually, that just changed my view now.
Yeah. I could never figure this out. Like, there was we've seen this happen so many times. There's like a date where everybody's like, yeah, it's going to happen on this day. And there were a bunch of people that sold their houses. I was like, what's the point? Like, what are you going to do with that money?
Have to have faith, Joey.
Right.
Jared, before I start asking some specific questions, do you want to ask anything else about just the general view here?
No, I think you've done a great job. I mean, I think the best question so far was, why is this belief a bad thing? And I think the points raised were excellent points. So,
all right. So, a lot of these questions are just so fun for me. First of all, do y'all think there is such thing as an antichrist, like a specific person that will be groomed by Satan, that is birthed into the human race and is gonna bring peace on earth and all that stuff? Like, what's y'all's theology on the Antichrist?
Do you want to go first, Jason?
You can go, because you mentioned something about that earlier.
I do. Okay, I do not believe that. I do not. I believe that in Revelation 13 that it's actually talking about Nero, that he's actually the beast. And the mark of the beast is in their forehead and on the back of their hand. But in apocalyptic literature, there's always a dualism. And so right before that, the servants of God are marked in their forehead. And so then after that, the servants of the beast are marked in their forehead. So I think it has the person in Revelation 13 that this is just another way to talk about Caesar. I don't think that there is a world leader.
Yeah.
Who will be that?
Yeah. One of the things that Bob was mentioning earlier, talking about historical events that are mentioned and stuff like that, is one of the reasons that I would tend to fall into the camp of people that would agree that the beast being spoken of, the Antichrist, is probably Nero Caesar, in the sense that John seems to be very specific about telling the audience, the original audience, that they'll be able to figure out who he is. It doesn't seem like he's trying to say, like, well, hey, look, don't worry about figuring out who he is, because it's not going to be for like 2,000 years, and you'll be way dead by then.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He's telling his original audience, you're going to know who this is. So there are people that do all that, gematria stuff, and they can figure out the names. I'm not going to get into all that. I just think it probably makes the most sense that Nero's the guy.
Are we discounting completely the idea then that God could have inspired this writing for people in the future?
Oh no, I wouldn't say that. I was gonna go on to say that, I mean, and I'm sure you've heard this line of reasoning before. I mean, from amillennialist type people, but I mean, I think it's really hard to sort of be like, well, no, it's going to be this one guy, and he's going to do all these particular things. When it's like, gosh, man, if I was living in 1940s Poland, and you told me that Hitler wasn't the Antichrist, you know what I mean? I would be like, you're out of your mind. He has to be the guy.
Yeah.
Or if I was living, at any other given point in history, and I would take that all the way back to 270 AD with Nero. I mean, so I think he can be a type in the literature as well as a literal person for that time.
I definitely agree with that.
So but one of the things he was talking about events that are mentioned in the book. But one of the things a lot of people will say is the events that's not mentioned in the book. He doesn't specifically mention the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, I may be mentioning it in apocalyptic language, predicting it, but there's no specific mention of it being a past event. And so I would argue, and this may be somewhere we disagree, I would argue that that it was written, I think it was written even earlier than a lot of people will say. I think it was probably written before the destruction of the temple. But my point is, if you take that view that he hasn't mentioned it, like if I was writing something like a history of America and I didn't mention 9/11 when I was talking about the history of New York, you'd probably be like, well, gosh, he must have written this before 9/11. If he's not going to mention that, it's a pretty huge event in that time period. So I guess what I'm getting at is I take all of that, put it together, and I would come to the conclusion that the Antichrist is someone who is going to come and do something very soon and very bad, and that I think that lines up very well with Nero and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD.
But if Revelation is meant to be an apocalyptic look at the future, if Jerusalem had already been destroyed, why would you have to put that in there? If it was future oriented.
I don't have as articulate of a way of breaking it down as Robert was using Baucham's explanation of the different chapters, but I would say there are different. I mean, there's the letters at the beginning of the book of Revelation. That's definitely a different part of the book, and that's warning particular people groups or talking to particular people groups about things that are going to come. And again, like I said, not mocking them. Hey, this is 2,000 years in the future. Don't worry about it. It's like he's actually talking to them about something that's coming. But then I think there are transition points in the book of Revelation. Bob, if you wanted to jump in on that one.
Transition points between what now?
Between when he's talking about things that are in the immediate
past, present,
future or past, and then going into the future as future prophecy.
Yeah, I think that the original readers, they assumed that it had a good chance of happening within their lifetime. Even the very end with Jesus coming back and that kind of thing. But I think the Book of Revelation, again, the overriding message to these guys is like, you're going to be persecuted. It's coming your way, and so you need to persevere. To like in I think it's chapter 20 talks about the lake of fire. And says the cowardly. And all liars and cowardly were thrown into the lake of fire. I remember reading that going, wow, what is so bad about being a coward? that you're like the first people. Liars, I get it. That's in the Ten Commandments, but cowardly. But it's, people who couldn't stand up for the persecution that was coming. So I don't think there is like necessarily a key transition point where it moves from, okay, now John is here saying this is specifically the future, way in the future. I think those 7 churches, I think when they got it, that letter, and they read it out loud, and they understood it all, like, okay, we can see this. We can see that this is probably going to happen in our time or shortly after our time. So we're going to persevere, and we're going to hang in there.
Yeah.
Man, Tim LaHaye made a bunch of money on stuff that's just so off. He's brilliant.
Well, man.
Historically speaking, you don't really get the futurist sort of dispensationalist view, which is what the Left Behind book series is built on. You don't really even get that appearing in the church until like the 19th century. So that doesn't mean that doesn't mean it's totally wrong. But right. John Nelson Darby is like the main guy accredited with, sort of taking all of what people were thinking prior to that and being like, no. This is like way, way, way in the future, and it's all way in the future, and it's because God has 2 different people groups, so he's coming twice. Right. Once, and regardless of what anyone else thinks, I mean, that that makes me skeptical of it. It doesn't make it wrong. Just because it's new doesn't make it wrong, logically speaking. But it makes me skeptical of it. But now it's like you said, we all grew up hearing it like it was, just water that we were drinking. It was like in the water.
Hey, you guys would get a kick out of this when we were bombing Kuwait in 91, I think it was. I seriously went to bed terrified because I just knew the rapture was going to happen. I was like, I didn't know if my heart was ready. I didn't know if I was going to.
How'd you make that connection? Like what?
I mean, you saw the bombing. Good Lord!
But I didn't think Rapture.
Well, you weren't mentally ill.
Okay, whatever.
Hey, every major event like that, there's been somebody like John Wolvert or Tim LaHaye or somebody's come out with a book like, okay, here it is. Like there were so many things circulating about Iraq. Iraq's in the Bible more even than Israel, and blah 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 blah. And so this is the key event, and of course, a big part of this chronology that is sold, and I call it the last times theology, is that Russia will invade and invade Israel and be destroyed, and with this big nuclear weapon. And so when something happens around Iraq and Iran, it's always like, aha, this is going to bring them forward.
Yeah.
I lived in Russia for about a year and a half, right after the Soviet Union fell.
Dang.
And, the whole thing about like entitlement and all that, it was very interesting because, there's that whole thing that Gog and Magog, that's really Russia. And they're going to come in, they'll be defeated by the Antichrist. That's how he will kind of get his establishment and all that. So I'm working with these people who have come out of just extreme poverty and just the stagnation and the lessening persecution of the Soviet Union and that kind of thing. I'm thinking, this is Gog and Magog?
Yeah.
How many more blood moons do we have until?
Exactly.
Hey, well, let me get off track just a little bit, but there's some tie-ins here. Do you guys think that people that are dead right now, so in their graves, are they consciously awake somewhere right now, or do y'all believe they're sleeping?
I believe they're consciously awake.
So some in heaven and some in hell?
Well, hell is a challenging concept that I haven't had the chance to do all of the work on that concept that I'd like to. I mean, I've received an understanding of it, but it is hard for me to really grasp the idea that God is somehow glorified by people continuing to suffer.
Yeah.
So I find myself emotionally drawn to the idea of annihilationism. I do believe that people, though, who are, I'm searching for language here. I'll pick a term. In right relationship with God, I believe that those people, I believe we pass into the presence of Jesus. I believe we're there with him.
Yeah, so they're just like, they're on a linear timeline waiting their asses off, right? I mean, seriously,
yes.
so they, like people that died 1,000 years ago, they've been hanging out having a really awesome time for 1,000 years.
Persevering, you bet, in another realm.
That's where the notions of paradise and Hades come in, right? Like holding places? Okay.
Right.
Jason, any point of contention there?
I mean, I don't necessarily have a point of contention. I would say, though, there are some annihilationists, I would think, who would hold without issue to the idea that, at least temporarily, prior to the final judgment, those who aren't in the presence of God are, somewhere. They haven't been annihilated yet. But my take on it would be, I definitely think that we go either consciously to be in the presence of God or to not be in the presence of God when we die. But I think there's a side issue there to the problem. Like you asked the question earlier, what's bad about believing this thing? And I think one of the misunderstandings that often goes around is this idea of like, well, when I die, I go to heaven, and like that's it. And so I would definitely take issue with, and I think you guys were all agreeing, but I would definitely take an issue with the idea that like Christianity is about dying and then going and like floating around as an ethereal spirit up in heaven, and that's it. So I think that brings us back to the book of Revelation and to the concept of a new heavens and new earth, and that ultimately Christianity is about like, the restoration of everything. Yeah. Not just me dying and, floating off to have a harp. Yeah. And wings.
But you'll have a glorified physical body.
And a harp.
Not a harp. A bass guitar in your case, right?
A really sweet
Jared, don't take his harp away.
electric
Good Lord.
harp.
Don't take his harp away. Yeah, I actually think that there's a good chance that we, like, maybe originally we were intended to be able to explore the whole universe, and that's partly why it's so vast,
Oh,
is
yeah.
because we'll spend all eternity visiting galaxies and inhabiting planets. And I know it sounds crazy, but I think there's even a chance that we'd be able to view different times of history, almost like, walking in different times. Not that those times are resurfaced, but that we get to kind of see
For
it
God's
and
massive
experience
archives.
it. Yeah, I don't know why not. All right, well,
And there's some times that I really hope people don't come back and hang out with me.
For sure.
all right, let me read something that it just blows my mind. And I think when people read this for the first time, they're like, what in the world? But Matthew 27:52, and the tombs broke open, the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. So kind of real life zombies. How do you guys explain this? Like, what do y'all think's going on here?
That is one of the strangest passages in the New Testament, without question.
Yeah.
It's very weird.
Yeah.
In 1 Corinthians 15, I think it is. I know Paul talks about the resurrection there, but yeah, that's one where he says that all these people are still alive who saw Jesus, and you could go ask them if this was not the case. And sometimes I put those two pieces together, but I got to be honest with you. I stand before that text, and I say that's in the scripture that's been handed down by the church, and so I receive it as such. But I don't really understand that because if I think about it for a few minutes, like, okay, so these people have come out of the grave like that. Okay, were they there long? What did they look like?
Right.
Did they come back at their optimum age and physical fitness and that kind of thing? And what did people think? And then what happened to them afterwards?
Yeah. Did they die again?
Yeah, did they just like disappear? After like 3 days or something, 40 days, they just ceased to exist and they were kind of gone, or what happened?
Were they really fast moving, like in the movie with Will Smith? I mean,
Yeah. Which kind of zombies were they? Walking Dead or World War Z zombies?
Right.
Dang, man.
What do you think, Jason? Any thoughts?
I don't really have any deep thoughts. I mean, I know it's a passage that split a lot of people, and has put some people in the camp where they're like, I don't know if we should take this literally, and the people are like, well, I don't know if I should take you literally.
Yeah.
As a Christian, and I'm kicking you out of my church. I mean, I just take it as a sign, as a mass resurrection sign that's entirely within the realm of what I think. I mean, I'm not saying anybody would think God can't do it, but I guess what I'm saying is I've never really spent much time thinking, well, gosh, how did they look when they came out? And I've just kind of looked at it as, a mass sign to the people who would be, asking questions about Christ. So,
well,
I filed that under.
Let me let you guys in on a major Svensson secret. Jared is not my brother, but he is actually Ezekiel, the carpenter's son, who passed away, and he was one of these guys that rose, and so they are kind of immortal. So just letting you guys know.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Hey, you think you could come to California and do some magic tricks or something?
awesome.
I sense a really big offering if you come out here.
Jared, what were you going to say about that?
Oh, I was going to say, with that scripture, I mean, I just think I filed that under the whole idea that the world is bigger and crazier than we can ever imagine, as well as the supernatural is bigger and crazier than we can ever imagine. So I don't have a problem with it. I mean, I know in part right now, so it's crazy and weird, but I have no problem accepting it.
Yeah, I do know there are people. I mean, since we're all seeming to more or less say the same thing, I would say, from the other perspective, I do know there are people who take that as this is apocalyptic language. He's not actually talking about people who are resurrected. He's not actually talking about rocks being split. He's just using the sky being darkened. He's just using apocalyptic language to refer to how bad the death of Christ was. And that rubs a lot of people really the wrong way to say that maybe it's non-literal. But
yeah. All right, well,
yeah, it doesn't bother me either way. I just don't know.
Yeah. All right, well, the $1 million question that we'll end all of this on, and that is, do you guys think that we've got like life as we know it right now, how long is this going to go on? Do you guys think? And I don't want to hear, well, no one knows the day or the hour. I know that. But what do y'all think? If you had to guess.
How long does the human race have before Jesus returns? Is that really the question?
Yeah.
In some sense?
Yep.
Well, Jason has wisdom in his name.
Yeah.
So I think he should go first.
Yeah. I mean, if I had to guess, I would say I think we got a long time left. I mean,
what does that mean? Long time.
No, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, I can't put a time on it, and you said not to say that. But what I would say to avoid that is to say, I mean, I would say I don't buy into the whole like, oh my gosh, look at this thing. That means it's happening like tomorrow.
Yeah.
I don't buy into that notion. So maybe it's gonna be a long time, and that means 1,000 years. Maybe it's gonna be a long time, and that means like 100 years. I'm not sure, but I will say the one thing I can be sure about is that I don't buy into the alarmism, sort of like, oh my gosh, like, you know, Hamas is launching rockets at Israel, and that means that like tomorrow it's going to happen. And John Hagee preached this awesome sermon about the blood moons, and I got his book, and it's going to be half off after the blood moons thing doesn't happen. Get it on sale. You know, but I don't buy it, and I never have, because like I said earlier, I mean, if I lived in the 1940s, I'd have been like, man, this is got to be it. And then here we are.
Yeah.
And it hadn't happened yet in the 90s. And I mean, so I guess what I'm saying is I don't expect that it's going to happen really soon.
Yeah.
But if it does, we'll see.
What about you, Bob?
Okay.
And I really want to know, does anybody have a pterodactyl in their house? There's like a weird...
That's a screen door, probably, right?
No, I have a velociraptor, but...
Okay, my bad.
Not a pterodactyl.
Okay.
So, you know, on the one hand, I think, boy, it could just go on forever. It could go on for a really, really long time. On the other hand, like I look at the situation we find ourselves in today, where, you know, we have so many ways to ruin our habitat, so many ways to destroy ourselves. And we're living in such a strange period of time where, you know, modernity it's such a good, such an easy target to pick on, but modernity had some good things to it, like the sense of ideals pulling people forward, that progress was a good thing. And it seemed like civilization, we need those hopeful things to kind of go forward. And in my opinion, we're living in an increasingly skeptical age. And the one thing that was kind of carrying us forward as a massive civilization was globalization. And it seems like that's really breaking down around the world. And so I feel like we are in danger of destroying ourselves. And I wonder if that's the thing God's waiting for. It's not that he's angry. He's like, okay, that's it, man. You guys just can't play well with each other anymore.
I've got a question. I know you were supposed to be done. I'm not supposed to ask questions, but
No,
Bob,
do it.
Bob, did you say your age earlier?
No, I did not. I'm 60.
I was just, because it seemed like, I wonder if the difference between the way I'm looking at it and the way you're looking at it on this one, I wonder if it's a generational thing in any way. I wonder when you were 32, I'm 32. Did you have maybe the same outlook, or is that something you think has developed more as you've gotten older?
The same outlook that I have in terms of what I just shared about, like the state of the earth today.
I guess what I'm wondering is, I'm just wondering, you know, I wonder who was 60 in their 60s when you were in your 30s, and if they would have looked at you and been like, man, any day now, things are getting so much worse.
Yeah.
I guess I'm not trying to say either's right or wrong. I'm just...
No. It's an interesting question. So I can go back to my 30s, and I can think about people I knew who were in their 60s, and generally speaking, those people tended to be more optimistic than pessimistic. Yeah. Because there was, you know, in that generation, there was an idea that, you know, they still bought into all of the, you know, the national myth of you know, we're spreading liberty and democracy, we're building to a good tomorrow. And they saw their lives, you know, building their retirement and so on. They saw themselves as building that larger thing that was a United States, Christian nation, you know, a prosperous future. Where I think now my generation, as we're coming to, this same stage in our lives, I think that picture is a little harder to sustain,
Well, it's because of the reality around us.
Absolutely. And you can't escape it. I mean,
right.
We have the internet now. We have cell phones now. You can't escape it. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you guys have any promotional items? Tell us your band's name again, Jason.
Death Therapy.
Death Therapy.
DeathTherapy.org.
DeathTherapy.org. And you said it's like thrash techno?
It's like techno industrial metal stuff.
Yeah.
9 Inch Nails with screaming.
Cool. And Bob?
First, I want to say this. It is a pleasure to spend time with people who go by the name Bad Christian and Death Therapy.
Yes.
And to have a chance within that to talk about the Bible and zombies, it is a singular pleasure to have a conversation like this. The two things, I have a website, bobharper.org. Nothing vain in that title. But I did a series of teaching on the book of Revelation about 5 years ago and posted them up there. If anybody was interested in a little bit deeper look within the perspective that I have shared on this show, they could get that there.
Awesome.
And then I have also my own church website, venturavineyard.org, where we have constant, every week we're updating that. And in our particular church, we're really pressing into kind of the issues where how do we understand the Bible today in a world that doesn't accept ancient wisdom, but rather looks for things that are determined by science and by experimentation and so on. So how can we follow ancient wisdom in a thing like that? So
awesome.
Like we had Pete Inns, not in our church, but we had him at our church for a conference that we did. So we're pushing in that kind of way. So if people are interested in that kind of thing, they could find some help there.
Yeah. Awesome. Good spending time with you guys. I really enjoyed it.